The media fixates on missiles and airstrikes, a televised spectacle designed for diplomatic statements and calls for de-escalation. This is a fundamental misreading of the strategic calculus. The launch of a missile is loud. The true vector of collapse is silent. The critical vulnerability is not a city, it's a signal. According to CSES threat models, the global economy's central nervous system is a network of undersea fiber optic cables. The kinetic cost of destroying a carrier group is immense. The strategic cost of severing a few key cables is absolute. The second vector is orbital, satellite blinding. You do not destroy the satellite, you deny its signal. You sever the optic nerve connecting the financial markets to the military apparatus. You create the blind Leviathan, a superpower with unmatched force, rendered inert. Its navigation is gone. Its financial transactions are frozen. It is a giant without eyes, unable to respond to a threat it cannot see, just as the first shockwave of financial collapse begins. This is not a mistake. It's a blueprint. The trigger is internal decay. Reports confirm Iran's economic crisis, driven by a currency collapse and sanctions, now threatens its core national security. The regime's own army has issued warnings about the need to quell growing domestic unrest. This is the critical liability. The Iranian state is not fighting an external enemy. It is fighting for its own survival against a bankrupt economy and an agitated population. We have a recent blueprint for this exact protocol. RUSI analysis of Russia's actions demonstrates that a state burdened by significant domestic liability, in that case, an unpopular war and economic stagnation, is forced to escalate externally. It is a political launch-on warning system triggered not by military threats, but by the risk of domestic insolvency. The kinetic event becomes the regime's last remaining liquid asset, used to redirect national anger outward. A state in this terminal condition cannot afford a symmetric war. The kinetic cost is prohibitive. Therefore, its weakness dictates a mandatory pivot to asymmetry. The goal is not to defeat a carrier group, but to impose a disproportionate financial shock on the adversary. It is a zero-sum transaction. Inflict systemic chaos abroad to generate political capital at home. This asymmetric vector is aimed squarely at the United States' primary systemic liability, its balance sheet. Per Ray Dalio, the U.S. is paralyzed by a $38 trillion national debt. This financial burden removes the nation's capacity to absorb the shock from a targeted, asymmetric attack. Iran's motive is solvency. The weapon is asymmetry. The target is not military hardware. It is the fragile liquidity of the Western financial system. The critical asymmetry is not ideological, it is economic. The entire blueprint for 20th century warfare has been rendered obsolete by an inversion of kinetic cost. A report from the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, quantifies this disparity. A single main battle tank, a kinetic asset valued at approximately $5 million, can now be neutralized by a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a balanced equation. It is a mathematical leverage point for systemic disruption. This phenomenon is termed the democratization of violence. It represents a catastrophic collapse in the cost of projecting lethal force. States facing a solvency crisis and internal decay, as documented in Iran, are no longer barred by capital expenditure from challenging a superpower. The barrier to entry for kinetic engagement has been effectively erased. An adversary can now achieve strategic effects for the price of consumer electronics, transforming the global security landscape into a zero-sum arbitrage of lethality. The United States military, predicated on high-cost, technologically superior platforms, now faces an unsustainable economic liability. It is forced to counter a 10,000 to 1 cost asymmetry. Deploying a multi-million-dollar missile to intercept a $1,000 drone is not a victory. It is a managed bankruptcy. This creates a vector for an attritional strategy where an adversary's goal is not to win on the battlefield, but to force a launch-on-warning response that accelerates the defender's own financial collapse, leveraging its $38 trillion debt as the primary weapon. The map you see on the news is a distraction. The hotspots, flickering from the Middle East to Africa, are not disconnected fires. They are networked. This is the gray zone, a global proxy laboratory for developing and stress testing asymmetric attack protocols. These are not wars for territory. They are exercises in creating maximum systemic disruption at minimum kinetic cost. Analysts at RUSI and CSIS have flagged emergent instability in nations previously considered stable, from South Africa to Canada. This is not coincidence. It is calibration. Each event is a data point, measuring the response time, political paralysis, and supply chain fragility of Western systems. They are mapping the operating system of our society to find its critical exploits. For a state facing an existential solvency crisis, this is a mathematical necessity. Reports confirm Iran's currency collapse and growing internal unrest threaten its national security. It cannot afford a conventional war. Instead, it leverages the gray zone to perfect a launch-on-warning protocol, not for missiles, but for economic contagion. The objective is to discover a non-kinetic vector that triggers a cascade failure in its adversary. This brings us to the payload. These protocols are not designed for regional adversaries. They are precision engineered to target the single greatest liability in the global system, the $38 trillion U.S. debt. As Ray Dalio's analysis confirms, this is a structural vulnerability with zero capacity to absorb a major shock. The gray zone is where the weapon is forged. The American economy is the target. The doctrine is designated launch-on-warning. It is a Cold War protocol that mandates a full-scale kinetic response based not on confirmed detonation, but on sensor data indicating an imminent missile attack. According to analysts at CSIS, the system was engineered to bypass human hesitation, ensuring a retaliatory strike is launched before command and control infrastructure is vaporized. This protocol contains a systemic vulnerability. Its entire architecture is predicated on data integrity. A successful cyber attack does not need to disable a missile. It only needs to blind the early warning radar or spoof an incoming signature. This creates the fog of digital war. The commander is now trapped in a zero-sum calculation. If the warning is real and they fail to launch, their nation's strategic arsenal is neutralized on the ground, representing a catastrophic failure. If the warning is a digital ghost and they launch, they initiate global thermonuclear exchange. The protocol's logic, as documented by RUSI, mathematically incentivizes action over inaction. This is the entry point for asymmetric escalation. a state facing existential threats from internal decay, such as Iran's documented economic crisis and growing unrest, doesn't need parity in warheads. It only needs to inject this ambiguity into its adversary's decision matrix. The threat is not a missile. It is the forced error. The system is designed to launch out of fear. The internal decay of a state operates on a predictable mathematical curve. As Iran's currency collapse accelerates into a systemic solvency crisis, reports from Homeland Security today confirm this has become a primary national security threat. The Iranian army's warnings against growing domestic unrest are not a sign of strength. They signal a critical threshold has been reached. When the cost of internal suppression exceeds the kinetic cost of external conflict, the governing protocol shifts to asymmetric escalation. This is not a choice, it is a calculation. The vector for this escalation targets a known liability, the adversary's inability to absorb a shock. As Ray Dalio's analysis confirms, the United States' $38 trillion national debt is not a future problem. It is a present-day paralysis. This liability removes the capacity for a conventional launch-on warning response, as the fiscal blowback would trigger an immediate liquidity crisis. The system has no slack. The primary adversary is not the Iranian state. It is the mathematical certainty of U.S. insolvency. Therefore, the next phase is not a declaration of war. It is a calibration shot. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a targeted, non-kinetic event engineered for maximum economic disruption with zero attribution. The highest probability vector is a synchronized cyber attack against a Tier 2 U.S. port authority, such as Charleston or Savannah, and its corresponding regional data infrastructure. The objective is not destruction, but a 72-hour halt in logistics. An event just small enough to be deniable, yet large enough to test the solvency of a system with no capacity to absorb the impact.